My name is Susanna Bloom, and I'm the director of the defense program here at CNAS. And today we're here to talk about innovation in defense. Joining me is Michelle Flournoy, who is a CNAS co-founder and current member of our board of directors. She's also co-founder and managing partner at West Exec Advisors. And last but not least, I want to remind everyone of Michelle's last post in government, which was as the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. Also joining me here is Ben Fitzgerald, adjunct senior fellow with us in the defense program here at CNAS. Ben is also a partner at Lupa Systems, which is a private investment firm, and his last role in government was as the executive director for strategy, data, and design in the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition and Sustainment. And prior to that, Ben was a professional staff member on the Senate Armed Services Committee, where he worked on the acquisition issues in the FY18 NDAA. And also joining us today, Gabrielle Sheffitz, who's a senior associate at West Exec Advisors. And before we dive into the conversation, I want to explain a little bit about why I've asked this specific group of people to join me here today to talk about this topic. So Michelle and Gabrielle have just released a really good report, Sharpening the U.S. Military's Edge, Critical Steps for the Next Administration. And that paper focuses on what DoD needs to do, in the coming years to sustain U.S. military technological advantage. And this paper is part of our broader series in support of the next national defense strategy. And Ben actually has a forthcoming paper for us about what the private sector can do to ensure the U.S. sustains military technological advantage. So this group of experts gathered here today has been looking at this question kind of from two different directions. What can the government do? What can the private sector do to make sure that the U.S. retains its technological edge in the defense space? So before we get going, I'm just going to run through a few quick admin notes, and then we'll dive into a bit of a discussion here amongst us four. This conversation is public and it will be recorded and posted for public consumption once we've concluded here. We're going to reserve about 15 to 20 minutes at the end of our conversation here to take questions from you, the audience, who are logged on here today. To submit your questions, please use the Q&A function that you'll find in the toolbar at the bottom of your screen. And please also note that we will not take anonymous questions. So you must identify yourself in your question if you would like to have that question answered. And if you have technical difficulty at any time during the event, please email Molly Parrish at mparrish@cnas.org. So without further ado, let's dive into the meat of today's conversation. And I want to start by defining terms here. So innovation, it's a word that has been bandied about more and more in the past several years in defense circles. Michelle, what do we mean when we say that DoD needs to be more innovative?
So first of all, thank you for convening us. I've been really looking forward to this discussion with all of you. I think in the case of DoD, innovation means the art of gaining competitive advantage by leveraging not only new technologies, but new concepts of operation to transform how the U.S. military operates. It's really a way of getting an edge, and in the context of great power competition, particularly ensuring that we can leverage our strengths, exploit the vulnerabilities of others, and in my mind, the number one objective of sharpening the edge is underwriting deterrence, making sure that we can deter any kind of conflict between nuclear powers.
Yep. Ben, did you have anything to add to that in the definition of the terms?
No, I think Michelle's got it.
Okay. And Michelle, back to you again. Why is this such a critical issue for DoD? Like, what is the real driving imperative here?
So I think the imperative is that we do see, obviously, a revanchist Russia, but also a rising China. Both countries have gone to school on the American way of war. Both have invested substantially over several decades to try to undermine those strengths and to challenge us in domains like cyber and space and in using new technologies that they have developed and adopted. And if we sit on our laurels, if we do nothing or too little, we will lose our military edge, which is something we've had for many decades and something that has been a foundation of our power and influence around the world. And what really worries me is that we may lose our ability to deter with confidence, meaning other countries could come to question our resolve and our capability to protect our interests, to protect our allies, and so forth. And particularly worrisome in Asia Pacific, which will be the region that is most essential to US prosperity and security over the next 50 years. So the stakes are really, really high.
Yeah, without a doubt. Gabby or Gabrielle, following up on Michelle's answer there, can you give us a little bit more detail on what China has been up to over the past decade that has put the US military in this spot?
Sure. So as Michelle noted, China has really been studying the American way of war for the past 20 plus years and is focused on investing in a range of innovative technologies and approaches that really seek to undermine the US military advantage and really exploit some of its vulnerabilities. So quickly, I want to highlight a few of these key investment areas and then talk a bit about what this means for the US military in the future. So first and of greatest concern is really China's substantial investment in a range of A2AD or anti-access area denial capabilities. So this is everything from long-range precision munitions that could strike US forces and bases and logistics in the region to cyber and electronic capabilities that could take down US command and control or battle networks at the outset of any conflict. And then the second big area is China is really making a big bet on the future of AI and autonomy and human machine teaming, and fundamentally believes that whichever side is going to be able to make and execute decisions on the battlefield more quickly is going to have this ultimate advantage. So this has really important implications for how the US military is going to need to fight in the future, and is going to require a pretty fundamental reimagination of how we're going to fight in a far more contested and lethal environment. So a big issue is that we're no longer going to be able to expect to quickly gain and achieve domain superiority. This is going to be something that the US military is going to need to fight to gain and then to keep throughout any conflict. So the US military, to counter this, is going to need to fight in a far more decentralized manner, leveraging asymmetric approaches to offset some of China's own capabilities, and with a much greater degree of jointness and integration. And this is going to require a whole range of investments and new capabilities, everything from resilient joint command and control to new manned and unmanned logistics to be able to supply this more distributed fleet. And then I just think the last thing that's important to note is really highlighting China's doctrine of civil military fusion that has enabled them to make such rapid technological advancements, particularly over the last decade. And commercial technologies like AI and robotics and quantum computing and 5G are going to play this really central role in the future competition with China, which means that the US needs its own response to civil military fusion, one that's democratic and capitalist, but that can bridge the gap between the private sector and the DoD and really enable DoD to harness and access and scale these innovations that are going to be so critical to bolstering our deterrence, as Michelle said.
Yeah. So Gabrielle, thank you. That's like a great rundown of the challenge that the U.S. military is facing. But happily, we're not quite starting from zero in this space. There has been some progress that DoD in particular has made over the previous years. And Ben, given your previous seats on SASC and then in ANS, can you bring us up to date on what has DoD already accomplished to ensure that the department can develop and access these critical technologies that we've been talking about?
Sure. So in terms of acquisition and sort of that technological innovation, not as much on the concepts of operation, which is vital, we've done a lot. So we've introduced a whole host of new acquisition policy, everything from the middle tier of acquisition, which is for rapid prototyping and fielding. We've expanded the use of OTAs, which makes it easier to get hold of commercial technology or commercially adapted technologies. We've rewritten the whole somewhat infamous 5000.02 acquisition policy and introduced this concept of an adaptive acquisition framework. We've created a bunch of new organizations, everything from the Defense Digital Service to the Defense Innovation Unit, SOFWorks, AFWorks, Naval X, any permutation involving the letter X, we've done it. We've created the Army Futures Command, Kessel Run. We created the Defense Innovation Board, and importantly, senior leaders have listened to the Defense Innovation Board, which is the real measure of one of those boards. And this has persisted across 4 secretaries of defense, going back to Hagel. So this is really important. And I think it's different from other sort of revolutions that we've sought to have in the department, where a lot of this is coming from the bottom up and isn't just language at the top. But your real question, though, was what has DoD accomplished? And I think the jury is still out there. So we've had a lot of activity, and a number of those organizations have done good work, particularly DDS and Kessel Run have refactored some major programs in important ways. We've got like over 50 programs in the middle tier of acquisition, but fundamentally, have we meaningfully improved our position against great power competitors? Or have we removed significant costs from current operations and deployed capability? And the answer is not yet.
Yeah. And so, Ben, to dig just another level deeper on that line of inquiry, you know, when we are talking about making some of these real changes and actually implementing, you know, all of these good ideas about how DoD can better access and ultimately field these technologies, right? Because if it doesn't make it to the field, it's not particularly helpful. You know, what are the entities and processes that we need to really look at and unpack to remove the roadblocks in this space in the department?
Yeah, it's a great question. This is part of the challenge, is that you have to basically look at all of the processes at the same time. Usually when we talk about innovation, we default to this sort of hating on the acquisition system. But we need to sort of parse that out and, you know, what are we really talking about? So when we talk about acquisition, we need to dig into 3 related processes: acquisition policy, 5002, middle tier of acquisition, OTAs, all that good stuff, but also the requirements process, which has recently been re-looked as in the last couple of years under General Irati, but also PPBE. We need to look at how resources are allocated. All 3 of those things are tied in acquisition. But we also need to look at other things like IT policy. So authority to operate is a big issue. You might have developed great software, but can you put it on a network? That's complicated. Personnel policy is critical in here. Can we get the people that we want? Security clearances is related. And I would also say legislative affairs. We need to look at both the formal and informal ways that the department works with Congress to request legislative fixes and to implement NDAA provisions. And the challenge there is that no single official, even at the highest levels of the department, is in charge of all of that stuff. And so you have to get to the Deputy Secretary of Defense before everything falls together, but the deputy isn't in charge of requirements. That's the responsibility of the vice. And so if anyone in this meeting hasn't had a chance to look at Michelle and Gabrielle's report, this is one of the key points that they make, and I think is a real contribution, is thinking about not just the process, but the architecture of the whole system, and then the leadership that you need to have in place to make that work. And that was one of the things I certainly experienced when we were looking at the reorganization of ATNL that was really challenging. Things that you want to fix aren't actually part of your area of responsibility, and you can't necessarily convince other people to do those things. And so in addition to thinking about each of the processes, think about the architecture, think about the leadership required for that, and then also think about the data-driven governance that we don't have for that, which is something that I could bang on about for a large amount of time. So I'll stop right there with that sort of laundry list.
Thanks, Ben. And you've previewed a little bit of the answer to my next question, but I want to go back to Michelle and ask, so, you know, Ben has outlined a pretty significant body of progress, but what is the unfinished business? What remains to be tackled in this space?
So it's a long list, but I want to start by underscoring the point that Ben made. I do think that leadership and architecture matter, because the department is going after this challenge with diffuse authorities, many actors, many divergent processes, and you got to get everybody rowing in the same direction. And I think making clear that this is a top priority of the leadership, recruiting and managing the key leaders as a team with clarity on who has what role, who has what accountabilities, having a something that I think was a best practice that the department got rid of, that's something that Bob Work started, something like the ACDP, the Advanced Capabilities and Deterrence Panel, I think it was.
Yes, exactly.
What the new name is, you know, an empowered group chaired by the Deputy Secretary and the Vice Chairman to drive this agenda every single day, and to stay on and to bring the stakeholders together, to get the services aligned on a common set of objectives and roadmap and so forth. So I think that leadership, process, and alignment is very, very important. And while I would applaud this administration for actually having, particularly under Secretary Mattis, gotten a better sense of department-wide priorities, they haven't really been able to realign resources to place big bets on those priorities. And so I think that's one of the things that still has to be done. The second thing I would say is the long pole of experimentation and concept development. It's one thing to invest in new technologies. It's quite another to really think creatively in an innovative manner about how we're going to leverage those technologies to fundamentally change how we fight in a way that gives us an advantage against a China or a Russia and so forth. And I don't think that's been enough of a focus. That's a huge area of opportunity. Happy to see some service and joint staff work starting, but we need to be further down the road. Another area is adoption. I mean, I think it was Eric Schmidt on the DIB who said, you know, DoD doesn't have an innovation problem. We do a lot of innovation. It's an adoption problem. We are not bringing things that are promising in prototype or demonstration into the force with speed and at scale in the way we will need to keep pace with the challenge. And then the last thing I'll say is this is going to require some tough trade-offs and decisions. I mean, the fun part of strategy, I like to say, is setting the priorities. The hard part of strategy is deciding where you're going to accept and manage a degree of risk. And it will require some risk management. And we've got to figure out how to bring Congress along. And one of the main recommendations maybe we might want to come back to is we argue for a very different approach and relationship with Congress to try to bring them inside the tent and make them a partner in this effort.
Yeah, we absolutely will circle back to the issue of Congress because it's a big one here. But first, I want to go back to Gabrielle and ask, you know, Michelle just described for us what's on the to-do list still, right? And so, what are the obstacles that are preventing the department from getting those things done?
Yeah, so I think that there are a number of key obstacles, but I think I would highlight just one that I want to focus on today, which Ben talked a bit about, which is the need to reform our personnel policy. This is a huge challenge across the department, both recruiting and retaining talent at all levels, both on the military and the civilian side, and we see this for a number of reasons. So first, there are a number of new pathways that Congress has authorized to recruit technical talent that are still being vastly underutilized. Second, the department really needs to create career paths specifically for technologists that will allow STEM talent from the service academies to go directly into technical roles. And more broadly, thinking through how do you create career paths and promotion pathways and professional development opportunities that will allow you to really retain and harness the technical talent that you do bring into the department. And then finally, and Ben mentioned this, there's this lengthy and complex hiring and security clearance process that deters so many people from even applying in the first place. But I think beyond this top technical talent of coders and computer scientists, AI and machine learning experts that are going to be kind of these critical high-end subject matter experts, that we try to emphasize in the report that it's really about building this broad ecosystem of a technologically literate and savvy workforce. So you have everyone from operators, HR, military lawyers, concept developers, acquisition officials that understand this technology enough to be able to know how to buy it and deploy it and trust it. And in particular, we really wanted to highlight the role of the acquisition workforce and really the need to train them or create this subcadre of the acquisition workforce that really understands best practices for acquiring software and other emerging technologies. These capabilities are developed in a much different way. They'll require this more agile and iterative approach. And so you need to think about how do you create different trainings and incentives and even career paths that will create this culture of risk-taking that will support a more agile and iterative testing and development approach. And so I think that that's one of the key areas that we really try to highlight in the report.
Thanks, Gabrielle. I actually want to interject an audience question here because it's related to the some of the personnel issues that you just described. From Alexandra Stark, she asks, how should DoD be thinking about diversity and equity when it comes to recruiting and retaining the best talent?
Can I take that?
Sure.
Yeah, near and dear to my heart. I do think that, from a moral and what's the right thing to do perspective, we want a national security and a cadre and a defense cadre that looks like America, given our democratic society. But I also think that when you open every job up to women, when you open every job up to qualified people of color, you dramatically expand the talent pool. If the Harvard Business Review studies are to be believed, they've actually correlated diversity of executive teams and boards to our organizational performance and actual profitability and bottom lines. I think you can find comparable results if we were to go that direction in government. It just makes sense. You need to draw on all of the talent that's available to us to get the best performers and to move down this road. So I think it's a very important part of the answer going forward.
Thanks, Michelle. And audience, just a reminder, keep those questions coming using the Q&A function in the toolbar at the bottom of your screen. So pivoting a little bit and back to Ben, when we are thinking about new companies seeking to do business with DoD, what are the primary barriers to entry? And I think there are almost two categories here, right? So there are some tech firms who do not want to do business with DoD. And so what does the department need to do to become a better customer? On the other hand, there are a lot of companies who do want to do business with DoD, but just find that really difficult. So can you elaborate on that for us a little bit?
Sure. So I think there's a lot that we could talk about under this topic or under this question, but at the most basic level, I think fundamentally it's that the difficulties of working with the Department of Defense outweigh the benefits relative to other opportunities. So there are no sort of like secrets on these difficulties: lengthy buying timelines, compliance burdens, security clearances, overly specified requirements, all of that stuff. And while there are certainly some, Silicon Valley, Washington, or civil military divide sort of issues at play, which are important and we need to pay attention to, and those need to be addressed, certainly my experience has been that it's those underlying business fundamentals that are the issue more than anything. And so business will put up with bureaucracy. Like the Fortune 500 are not easy customers to deal with. They have, just as many lawyers as the Department of Defense. Well, maybe not just as many, but they have plenty of lawyers as well. But people will put up with that bureaucracy, but only if it's worth it. And the thing that's changed over the last 30 to 40 years is that there's now a global market, so that for tech companies, that's much more appealing and less painful than dealing with the DoD. And so they're naturally going that way. There's a potentially apocryphal story that I was told a couple of times when I was in the department of an enterprising officer from one of the military services, who will go unnamed, who reached out a few years ago to Apple and wanted to replace BlackBerries. They're like, oh, well, we can innovate. It'll change our culture. We'll use iPhones instead of BlackBerries. And they said to a senior executive at Apple, who they managed to get hold of, we would like you to create a subversion of the iPhone for the DoD, and you just need to remove the cameras and Bluetooth and a couple of other things, and we could buy as many as 500,000 of these things. And at the time, Apple's selling 150, 200 million a year. So like, why would they de-spec a phone, create a different production process for that for 500,000 units? It's just not going to work. So I think that those are the fundamental barriers. There's a whole litany of things that we could get into of, FAR Part 12 versus FAR Part 15, technical data, those kinds of things. But fundamentally, I think it's just about how difficult it is to work with the department versus the size of the opportunity.
And Susanna, can I just jump in with a specific example? Looking more at the smaller end of, like, if you're a tech startup, you really want to have DoD as a customer, you have a great product, people, you get in there with the door with DIU or with SoftWorks or AFWorks or whatever, one of these, entry points. you win the competitions, you do a great demonstration, you have a fantastic prototype, you got people telling you they want to buy your product. And then they say, well, okay, it's great that you won that in 2019. So we'll get you into the budget in 2021. And for a startup, it's like, wait a minute, you're telling me I've got 12 to 18 months with no revenue from this, and you want me to just hang in there. So that's the valley of death, right? That is, and frankly, larger defense primes experience some of this with their R&D and prototype efforts as well. But it's that inability to pull those best-in-class solutions across that valley of death with whether it's bridge funding or other mechanisms to get into some kind of recurring revenue production situation that will enable the company to stick with DoD as a customer. So just to add a particular example, and I can name, number of small companies who've had exactly that experience.
And Susanna, just to pile onto that, it's an excellent point. And it goes back to Michelle's earlier point about the architecture and the organization between senior leaders on this. Because often where things fall down is, well, the people responsibility for the prototyping aren't the people who make the production decision. And those are different silos and different budget authorities and all these sorts of things. So unless you have at very high levels, people providing top cover for those things to transition, the decision makers at the coalface are doing their best and trying to make things happen, but they don't have authority to make a decision on behalf of someone else. And so it's one of those, like, through no individual actor's fault, we have these terrible outcomes. And those are the sort of systemic issues that we need to be able to address.
Yeah, I'll pile on there too. Why not? The problem that Michelle just described has its roots in at least three completely separate, but highly interrelated processes in DoD. It's an acquisition problem, it's a programming problem, and it's a requirements problem. Each of those processes contribute to that huge lag. And so I'll just give a shameless plug for a recent report that Molly Parrish and I put out, Make Good Choices DoD, which talks in more detail about those issues specifically. But back to you, Michelle, actually, what is it that DoD's senior most leadership needs to do to get after that valley of death issue and to more broadly ensure that the department can innovate in the ways that we've described? And I think this was a centerpiece recommendation in your report. Can you tell us more about it? Sorry, Michelle, I think you're on mute.
Thank you. Sorry about that. I do think that, setting this, sharpening the edge as a top priority, announcing a number of big bets, and then aligning resources to support those. And, if you want to circle back and talk about what some of those big bets might be, we can do that. I talked about, choosing and empowering a team of leaders who are going to function as a team and are capable of and committed to delivering the effort, clear empowerment, clear accountability. Empowering the deputy secretary and the vice chairman in particular to drive this agenda day to day. And then, I think in terms of this question of the valley of death and getting programs across that, I think there are a number of things that are worth exploring. One is to work with Congress to see if there might be certain types of situations in which they would authorize bridging funding, funding that would allow the continued iterative development of a capability, the refining of the requirements in more of an iterative, agile way until they get to a full-on production contract. That was one idea. I also think another approach would be to give the services a bit more flexibility in terms of reprogramming, but within a mission portfolio. So, if you were in the private sector, you would take a portfolio management approach to this. You have a given set of objectives in a mission area, you would place a bunch of bets, you'd start to develop them, and you'd periodically evaluate them and say which ones are paying off at reasonable cost, which ones are exciting but way too expensive and unaffordable, which ones are failing, and you'd keep reallocating resources to drop the things that are not working or not cost effective, and reinvest and double down in the things that are working and are paying off and are emerging as more promising. The Department of Defense is not allowed to do that, basically. And I understand, Congress has its power of the purse, its constitutional role, and I get that and I respect that. But I think within a mission area, within certain, maybe a dollar limit, enabling that portfolio management, particularly in the run-up to a production contract, and if you tie that with experimentation and concept development, that could be a really exciting way to sort of get us across that valley of death and get better answers as a result of the process.
Yeah, a really interesting idea, and I hope Congress takes you up on it. But Ben, what else can Congress do to help DoD get after this problem? What is their role here in facilitating defense innovation?
I mean, a bunch. It's great to see in the report that Michelle and Gabrielle have put together this focus on Congress. Speaking of someone who's gone from being a professional staff member into the building. Sort of like hitting the floors of the Senate Armed Services Committee offices, and then sort of seeing that interaction was really eye-opening. The way that often things don't work out despite everyone kind of having the same objective. So look, I mean, the first thing, and I'm going to sound like someone who used to work for John McCain, Congress is a co-equal branch of government here, right? So like they need to be brought on board, not just as like we've consulted with them, they're our board. No, it's a co-equal branch of government and needs to be treated as such. And I would also say that Congress is highly motivated to remove legitimate roadblocks. The number of times where you will see professional staff members or actual members, when they're meeting with people from the department, they're always saying, let me know what your problems are. How can I fix them? What we've seen, especially in the 2016 and 17 NDAAs, is Congress trying to lead the department down a path that the department wasn't quite ready for, I think. So if you look at things like opening up OTAs, other transactional authorities, the middle tier of acquisition, ACDEMO, which is a special category of hiring authority just for acquisition professionals to go after some of the things that Gabrielle was talking about earlier. All of those are efforts that Congress has made ahead of where the department was. And so if you don't have that alignment that Michelle is talking about, you have Congress not doing the things that the department needs, and then doing other things that the department doesn't think it needs. And then you get into this sort of like internecine oversight thing of, well, if you're not going to do the thing that I said from last year's NDAA, I'm going to hold up these nominations, or I'm going to give you more help, those sorts of things. So we need to figure out ways to get after that. And I think just to support Michelle's point, this thing about appropriations is really important. If we want to realign the program and realign the budget, you are not doing that without appropriators getting on board. So I think that in terms of the substantive decisions that need to be taken, we need Congress as a partner, particularly appropriators.
Yeah, thanks, Ben.
I would also say from a reform and modernization perspective, we need appropriators on board. Sorry.
Yes, certainly agree. And Michelle, I know you have some further thoughts about how DoD needs to change the way that it interacts with Congress in order to foster a better partnership behind some of these issues.
Yeah. So this is very much a two-way street, right? I think, too often when one is a senior official in the Department of Defense, your loyal legislative affairs staff tries to protect you from actually having to interact with members of Congress. And I think that is not going to sort of wins the kind of support that we need going forward. So I think rule number one is we need to figure out a way to bring more leading voices, key, appropriators, authorizers, key thought leaders in Congress on defense inside the tent. They need to understand why the sense of urgency. What is the problem? What are the stakes involved? What will happen if we don't move faster and at scale? We need to invite them into things like experimentation, concept development, looking at hard problems and how we're going to wrestle to solve them. We need to bring them inside the tent to help them, understand and hopefully buy into or take some ownership of some of these really critical problems that the department needs to tackle going forward. And I think if the department treats Congress more as a full partner and brings them in that way, maybe that would help them to do some of the hard things that the department may ask them to do. For example, I think a number of the services have had a hard time getting Congress to approve limited production of prototypes that they can use to experiment with and further define requirements and operational concepts. The Navy and the large, I think it was USV program, the Unmanned Surface Vehicle program is an example. They wanted to buy a few to experiment with, and Congress said, no, you don't know what you're doing, so we're not going to give you more than one or two. And it was a sort of catch-22. I think if Congress had a better sense of what are we trying to do and where are we trying to go, and how do these prototypes fit into the concept development and requirements definition process for the full production, they might, be willing to take that little bit of extra margin of risk to allow that kind of activity to happen. Most importantly is when the department does make some hard trade-off decisions, say, I really need to divest here in order to reinvest over here where it's going to help me sharpen my edge. That is where traditionally a lot of good decisions get reversed, again, because you may have members concerned about jobs in their district, but oftentimes you have members who really haven't been read into why this trade-off. Why is it so important? What happens if we fail to do that? And so I think it's worth trying to, again, bring them more inside the tent and have them own this problem with the Department of Defense.
Absolutely, absolutely. So switching gears a little bit, just for a final set of questions that I have for you, Ben, and to preview a little bit the work that you've been doing with us on the private sector's role in this space. Can you talk us through first, what are we talking about when we say the private sector vis-a-vis defense innovation?
Yeah, okay. It's good to break it down a little bit, because we have a tendency to be vague, and the private sector becomes this sort of like mythical provider of frictionless innovation. If only we could find its hidden mythical world kind of thing, and like speak the native language. So to really break it down, we've come up with some categories that we actually started doing when I was at CNAS, and I need to give Marty Bollinger a shout out for a lot of this thinking as well. So we think about 3 primary categories to set the appropriate policy and incentives. And we think about that in terms of the product or service offered to the department. So the first one is military unique systems or solutions. And so that's things that the traditional defense industry does: combat aircraft, hypersonics, anything that's nuclear. The third category is commercial technology. So things that Microsoft, Amazon would make, or mom and pop suppliers of spare parts, office supply companies, businesses that make things that solve general problems, including those experienced by the military or the Department of Defense. The second category is military adapted commercial technology. And this is the businesses that take the best commercial technology and deploy it for military needs, or take commercial approaches to developing military type capability. And we don't yet have really big breakout businesses in this area, but we need them. The best examples that we've got are Palantir, which I would consider a big breakout success, but a slightly different approach, and SpaceX. So we don't yet have policy for this. Like we have ways of doing military unique, we have ways of doing commercial, but we don't have policy for things that are in between. And most of this stuff that we're talking about, Defense Innovation Unit, other transaction authority, middle tier of acquisition, is going after that middle category. So it's those 3 categories that we see and that we think that we need to go after.
And just to dig a little bit deeper, Ben, what can each of these kind of categories of private company do to help DoD access and field the advanced technologies that we've been talking about?
Yeah, so I have a few thousand words of opinion on this right now, so I'll try to be brief. The first and high level. The first thing I would say is focus on core competencies, right? Like, I don't want Raytheon or Northrop Grumman to try to build an email server, but I also don't want Microsoft to try to build radar systems, right? So often in this innovation conversation, the traditional defense industry is cast as this unhelpful, out of date entity. I think that's unfair. They need to be able to focus on what they do and really go after those problems. Then the second thing I would say, keeping this high level, is to really jump into that military adapted commercial technology space and to innovate. We need traditional defense industry to get in there. We need commercial industry to get in there and come up with new technologies, yes, but also business models to try and do that. And we need to do that while focusing on what we're traditionally good at. One of my favorite things that I've heard from a traditional defense industry CEO was Mike Petters talking about R&D at Huntington Ingalls. And it's like, it's usually focused on welding, like new and innovative ways to weld. And I was like, that is the right answer. That's what I want to hear from a shipbuilder. I don't want to hear about, weird technologies or anything. So I think that for traditional defense industry, that means dragging in commercial tech. And then I think for commercial technology, that is about innovating around business models, go to market, how to collaborate and take the knowledge they learn from the Department of Defense, and then scale that for a broader user base. And the key theme in all of this is software. Software is the key challenge that we face, a key thing holding back key capabilities, and will be the area that we've got the most potential to generate military technical advantage in the future.
Great. Thank you, Ben. And more to follow from us in that space. As Ben mentioned, he's got several thousand words already on this topic, and we're really looking forward to sharing them with everyone once they're finished. And so with that, I'm going to turn over to posing some audience questions to our panel now. We've got about 180 people on the line and a lot of good questions in the queue already, so I apologize in advance if I don't get to yours. But I'm going to start with, we've got a couple questions here on going back to operational concept development, which is something we've talked about a little bit already today. But I'll start with Marcus Weisgerber from Defense One, who asks, the new concepts of operation that we're seeing are more network focused than hardware focused. And I think Marcus is probably, not to put words in his mouth, referring to the kind of JADC2 family, and it's at the heart of the joint all-domain concept of operations here that is emerging from the department. Congress typically focuses on hardware and is oftentimes unwilling to approve things like aircraft carrier or ship retirements in order to make space in the budget. And so what Marcus is asking is, how do you convince lawmakers to buy these things that are essential to the new CONOPS that are coming out when they don't necessarily involve big, expensive platforms? And Michelle, that's to you first.
Okay. So this is exactly an argument for why we need to bring more members inside the tent. I think members need to see war games in which the planned force, unchanged, what's already in the program and budget, does not fare so well against a future great power competitor, and may not be able to achieve U.S. objectives at acceptable costs. In English, there are scenarios in which they might lose, and so I think understanding that something needs to change, and this everything about the new concepts that the services and the joint staff are developing hinges on the notion of a network of networks that is resilient to constant attempts at disruption. Whether it's kinetic, whether it's electronic, whether it's cyber. And this is the core concept. This is the thing that has to be developed for everything else to work, or else all of the platforms that you buy and all of the shooters that you buy will not function as intended, and will not be able to deliver the results. So, but again, I don't fault Congress for not knowing that. If the department hasn't made a concerted effort to sit down and really walk them through it and have them experience some of the analysis that has energized the department's leadership to feel a sense of urgency.
And I have a related question here from Jim Miller, your successor as USDP. He says, given GIFCOM's epic fail on joint concept development and experimentation, he asks if you have ideas for how to do this vital joint work better, meaning, leverage the COCOMs better, FFRDCs, how do we get after that problem?
I think this will fail if it is a top-down, get to consensus, we're going to have a unified doctrine, from the top down. That's an approach that will fail. To me, in this aspect of innovation, it requires a structured competition of ideas. And that has to percolate from within the services. And then there needs to be opportunities for the services to compete concepts for solving the same problem or similar problems. In some cases, we might, the department might want to choose this, we like this one better than that, it's more cost effective. Other cases, you may want to deliberately go with some redundancy and having multiple ways to solve a problem to complicate an adversary's attack planning. So, but that element of competition is really, really important, and it needs to be incentivized at the highest levels before you sort of get to, a sort of enshrining of joint doctrine. I think if you go to that solidification too quickly, you will actually stifle the innovation that we need to really get after some of these hard problems.
And Susanna, could I just add very, very briefly to that excellent point? We have now an acquisition policy environment that allows for precisely what Michelle is talking about, and to avoid the failure mode, especially for big C2 systems, which is to take like a big acquisition MDAP approach to these types of things. So with the middle tier of acquisition, you don't have to have requirements. So the J7 can work with the J8 to experiment, and that can become the small R requirements. And then you can go out and start a small program if you've got a service sponsor and iterate on that briefly. And you don't have to POM for it. You don't have to turn it into a big program with a sustainment plan. And you can transition from that prototype into a rapid fielding program or into a program of record. So we have the policy. We just need, to Michelle and Gabrielle's big point in this report, we just need the leadership and the coordination to go out and do it.
Yeah. So actually, speaking of that kind of leadership, Lauren Daly asks, taking risks and accepting and learning from failure is an important aspect of innovation in the private sector, on the commercial side, but DoD is notoriously risk averse. So how can leadership help DoD become more accepting of risk and really embrace this idea of fast failures and the role that they play in innovation and technology development?
You want to just
Sure.
that to, okay. So, I mean, it matters where we take the risk. I don't particularly want to see DoD taking a lot of risk when we've got people in harm's way in the middle of an operation. But when it comes to technology development and particularly of emerging technologies and software enabled or software heavy technologies that require an agile iterative approach to development, that is a place where we need to accept a higher degree of risk than we do in a traditional defense acquisition program. I think the way to get that behavior is to, again, first of all, as Gabby suggested, train a subcadre of the acquisition corps to know how to manage an agile development process, which is very different from what they've been trained to, and then incentivize and reward that behavior. I think it was Assistant Secretary Gertz who told me that I think it was last year, one of their acquisition officer, he deliberately chose the acquisition officer of the year for the Navy, I hope I'm getting this right, as someone who had basically taken a risk to do something, to do a quick sprint that didn't actually ultimately work in and of itself, but was a huge source of learning that then made the next sprint towards a capability much more successful. And he was trying to communicate to the acquisition corps, this is what smart risk-taking, responsible risk-taking that gets us faster to the goal looks like. So you need to think about how you're going to train people, how are you going to incentivize them, how are you going to reward them, not only with recognition, but also career paths and a trajectory where they can keep refining those skills. I think it is so different from the traditional acquisition approach that you may need to have a subcadre with its own unique training, its own reward system, and its own career paths, as opposed to trying to make every acquisition professional an expert in software and emerging technology development.
Susanna, can I add just briefly on that? I think one of the key points we try to make in the report is about accepting some short-term risk to actually buy down risk in the future, and particularly for these emerging capabilities that will require these iterative approaches. So let's take, machine learning software, for example. It's pretty much every time going to be some amount of an experiment, because it's just very hard to fully anticipate how these systems will operate when deployed. So if we think about these as experiments and we try to quickly and effectively capture those lessons learned and use that to fuel the requirements process to evolve our development and testing approaches, I think we can take that on and then actually translate that into a much greater reduction of risk down the line, because we'll know exactly what we need to be buying, how these systems are going to operate, and make those kind of difficult cost and capability trade-offs that can really only come with some amount of experimentation.
Thanks, Gabrielle. So another sort of related question here from Bill Bender, and I think we'll start with Ben on this one. Bill says, it seems where we've seen pockets of success, it has taken new organizational constructs, e.g. standing up of collaborative cross-functional teams with fully empowered leadership of those teams to gain that success. And he cites DIU and CREL as examples. And so do you see this dynamic as being key to success in transforming DoD business practices and workflows? And is it possible to scale this approach across other parts of DoD where it might make sense?
It's really hard. So you get this thing of like, it's theoretically impossible for the Department of Defense to change. If you do small things, it doesn't move the needle. If you try to change the whole department, there's too much inertia. So apparently you can't do either. But I think the actual answer is you need to do both. And so the question is not just how do you create these organizations, and we've seen some success there with DIU, AFWorks, SoftWorks, this sort of constellation of organizations. The question is, at what point do you connect them back to the core, and how do you manage those relationships when they're not connected? So there isn't a one-size-fits-all answer. And again, it comes back to that the question of leadership and coordination. You can do either, but doing it with intent and coordination is what's going to make the difference. Otherwise, you're going to have these small organizations be pariahs and not get the support they need to scale, or they're going to be so close to the culture that you're trying to change that it won't work.
Thanks, Ben. I've got two related questions now, probably also for you to start with, Ben, from Jeff Bialos, who wants to know, how has the devolution of authority from OSD to the services, as well as the split of AT&L into ANS and R&E, impacted the department's ability to innovate?
I'm so glad that someone asked that question. I have a lot I could talk about there. Look, again, I think it's one of those questions of understanding roles and coming up with the right model. It's one approach to say we're going to have everything up at OSD. There are pros and cons to that. It's another one to say we're going to devolve everything. There are pros and cons to that. The challenge we've had over the last few years is we've kind of done a bit of both. And that's where we have real confusion. All the funding is in one place. You've got a little bit of oversight in others. I like the devolved approach, especially if OSD, and this is something that Ellen Lord has been focused on, really focuses on its role as a policy body, not a program management body, and as a governance body. So seeking to remove roadblocks as much as possible. And a great example of that would be some of the work we did with the Defense Innovation Unit, which, despite the fact that it works on OTAs, didn't have its own contracting authority. So as they raised that to us, Ellen, as the Defense Procurement Executive, was able to cede out authority to a bunch more people to use OTAs and make sure that DIU had the ability to execute its own organic contracts and not have to rely on other organizations. So look, I think that the devolution has been a net positive thus far, recognizing that there are risks that come with that, especially, will the programs do will the services do the right things? Probably not in all cases, but I think that on balance, this is a good approach.
Can I just jump in on that, Suzanne? I agree, but I think if you're going to devolve, you've got to complement that with a much more robust leadership function that sets clear priorities, clarifies roles and responsibilities, aligns efforts, does the sort of big picture portfolio management, makes hard trades. Otherwise, you get a lot of heat, but only so much light. I mean, you get a lot of activity, but not necessarily activity that's adding up to what the department needs at scale to meet the challenge.
I totally agree. And part of that is taking this a switch from, instead of looking at each program individually through major program reviews, looking at the functioning of the whole system and the portfolio, which is about data-driven governance. One of the things, and I hope that I don't get in trouble for saying this, when I got to OSD, I asked, how many programs of record do we have in the department? And as someone like at ANS, my office was directly across from the undersecretaries. Couldn't know that. And so I think that in my mind, the part of that is the trade. We'll devolve responsibility so that the services can execute. But the trade there is we want data on things. We're not going to look to put the 1,000-mile screwdriver on every program because that slows things down. But we do want to know where things are. And we actually implemented that for the middle tier of acquisition, which is a story that hasn't really been told, but I think is important.
Thanks, Ben. So this one in from Alexander Sander, name familiar to many of us. The amount of acquisition dollars organizations spend on a new technology or capability is often equated with impact or potential impact. And Alex wants to know, how can we change the conversation to measure impact on our competitive advantage to include things like the rate and breadth of adoption or inspiration of new operational concepts? And she wants to know, how can we better incentivize that right kind of spending? That's a great question. Michelle, maybe to you first, or Ben? Sorry.
No, it is a great question, and Sanders right in that, you know, we tend to measure level of effort and resourcing as opposed to what's coming out the other end, and how much change, how much advantage, how much you know, is actually being affected. You know, I would love to get to the point where we could actually measure that kind of out. But again, a lot of that is being disrupted by the inability to get prototypes and, you know, things that are in research and development into production at scale, where you could actually see whether the impact is there and measure it in some way. So, but it is a really insightful question and important thing to address. Ben, maybe you might want to jump in on this if you have other ideas.
I think it's the same dynamic as when Alex and I worked together at the Center for New American Security, where she was always at least 3 steps ahead of me. So I don't have a great answer, but we definitely need to get to that point. For me, I think there are intermediate steps that we need to work on, such as, you know, being able to have insight into our overall portfolio and look at all that sort of stuff. So we're still very focused on input metrics. If we can be looking, I think then obviously you get to output and then outcome after that. Let's sort of go through the crawl, walk, run, and then hopefully along the way we figure out how to do that. But it has to be back to this thing of being able to tie ConOps and also like contingency plans to the capability that we have, and then have that inform our decisions about the program overall, and vary our risk appetite over time, because the threat portfolio that we're seeing for today and for 20 years into the future is going to change frequently and in ways we don't expect.
And Susanna, I would just really briefly jump in. I think, Ben, that's a great point, and that's where investing more in wargaming and operational analysis really comes in, because it's, are we developing these concepts of operation, and are we investing in new technologies, and can we test and refine those through wargaming and experimentation, and use impact as a metric of, are we really investing in the things that are going to enable us to fight in the ways that we need to in the future?
Thanks, Gabrielle. I'm just going to ask one last question here, which is related very similarly. Bob Hale, former DoD comptroller, notes that organizations accomplish what their managers measure. And so do we have any further thoughts on what some of these metrics for progress would be, and specifically the output metrics that we've been talking about? Maybe I'll start with Gabrielle on this one.
Yeah, so I mean, we spoke briefly about this in the report, and it really comes down to incentives. So how do you think about creating the kind of culture and really rewarding people for it? So I think Michelle's example is a really good jumping off point. So can you take risk-taking and translate that into cases where you've actually stopped programs short of failure? Can you if you create a new kind of subcadre of the acquisition core, can you reward people? So thinking about acquisition officials as overseeing development and testing kind of simultaneously. Do you build a new type of program that considers and thinks through this more iterative testing approach and really builds this new dynamic, and do we hold that up as a model? So I think that those are a few examples, but it's what are the behaviors that we and the culture we're trying to create, and then how do you kind of back into performance metrics for that?
Yeah, I think I would just add, I think that if you do place some big bets, whether it's a secure and resilient C4ISR network of networks that can support the joint force in an A2AD environment, or AI-enabled decision support to ensure that our commanders can make decisions better, faster than the adversary, or fleets of integrated autonomous systems that can team with manned platforms. You could go through a list and start to flesh out some roadmaps that actually have milestones, that like by such and such point of time, we want to have this, deployed fully in this theater. Oftentimes, one of the best ways to do it is to think in terms of transformation of certain types of forces. Like we want to, have a fully reimagined carrier air wing that mixes manned and unmanned systems, buys back range and survivability, and long range precision strike, by and ready for experimentation, the first one by year X. Or we want a reconceived Marine Corps unit or a reconceived Air Force squadron. So I think sometimes translating those into very concrete things that become sort of prototypes in and of themselves, to experiment and explore, and then if they are successful, to scale from there. So I do think there are ways to break these things down into executable, measurable roadmaps with milestones along the way, so how you're doing and whether you're getting to where you want to go in the time frame you want to be there.
Thanks, Michelle. I think that's a great, pretty optimistic note to conclude our conversation. We're already a little bit over time. And so I just want to thank you very much, Michelle and Ben and Gabrielle, for joining me here today. Thank you so much to our audience who's tuned in. We had so many really great questions from the audience members. I apologize that we didn't get to all of them, but very grateful for your time today. Thank you so much.